You're watching Light Behind Bars, where real crime meets powerful redemption. Every story here is inspired by true events brought to life through deep emotion and fiction. If you're ready to explore the human side of justice, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because some stories deserve to be heard, not forgotten. Richard Evanitz. The name now stains the pristine pages of human memory like a blot of ink, an indelible mark that evokes earthly nightmares no one wishes to recall. Yet, before he became the embodiment of darkness. Richard was once a child, a fragile soul born under the South Carolina sky on a mid-August day in 1963, Columbia, the state's capital, where ancient oaks cast dappled shadows over sunlit streets and the sultry southern air clung to every breath, bore witness to the first tentative steps of young Richard Mark Evanitz. The Evanitz family, to outward appearances, was like any other middle-class household of the era, striving to build a normal home, a seemingly serene portrait amid the turbulence of 1960s America. His parents, though not always fully attuned to the intricate inner world of their son, endeavored to provide Richard and his siblings with a roof over their heads, meals on the table, and hopes for a brighter future. But even in the most ordinary settings, silent fissures can form, creeping like roots burrowing deep into the earth, waiting to rupture the surface. Richard's childhood was not captured in vibrant reels of joy or woven with sparkling fairy tales. Instead, it was a tapestry of muted tones, punctuated by inexplicable pauses that perhaps even young Richard could not name. They say the eyes are the window to the soul, but Richard's gaze, even in his earliest years, seemed to hold something different. It wasn't the playful mischief or boundless curiosity typical of children his age. Instead, his was a distant, detached look, as if he were observing the world from a private realm, a place others could scarcely reach, to the neighborhood children. Richard might have been remembered as the quiet boy, somewhat sullen, who preferred solitary games to the boisterous clamor of the crowd, while they chased each other under the golden Carolina sun or built sandcastles on nearby Myrtle Beach. Richard might have sat alone beneath a tree, watching ants march across the dirt, watching clouds drift lazily across the sky, or sometimes, simply staring into the void. His silence was not that of a tranquil soul, but rather the hush of an inner world roiling with unseen currents, thoughts he could not share, or perhaps chose to keep hidden. There were signs, faint though they were, that in the hindsight of later tragedy take on an ominous weight, a peculiar indifference to the suffering of small creatures. Perhaps, or a morbid curiosity veiled behind a calm exterior. Sudden, unexplained bursts of anger might flare and then subside, as if he were wrestling to cage some wild beast within, the adults around him, preoccupied with their own lives or unwilling to see, overlooked these fragile signals. To them, he was just a slightly odd boy, a bit reserved, but still a child deserving of love and protection. The family atmosphere, though not marked by any publicly documented upheaval, may have harbored subtle strains. The dynamics between his parents, unspoken pressures, and unvoiced expectations could have pressed upon a young child's psyche in ways no one could foresee. Richard may have sensed those undercurrents, the wordless unease, and in some way, they helped shape the person he would become. The absence of a deep emotional bond, a sense of absolute security, might have led young Richard to erect walls around himself, isolating his heart in a private world where shadows began to take form. As the elementary school years passed, Richard remained unremarkable, neither a prodigy nor a troublemaker. He glided through, a faint shadow in the memories of teachers and peers. Perhaps that very obscurity was the perfect disguise for what was quietly germinating within, for when no one watches, when no one questions. Darkness finds room to grow, sinking its roots ever deeper. Any unusual behaviors were often masked by an outward semblance of normalcy, even obedience. He might have helped with chores or appeared compliant, but behind that facade, a mind was beginning to probe forbidden territories, to entertain warped thoughts. This was the genesis of a descent into darkness, a journey whose horrific destination not even Richard could have foreseen. Those silent cracks in the soul of young Richard, small and nearly imperceptible, were the first chinks through which evil slipped, planting the seeds of crime, the light of childhood, meant to be radiant and warm, was for Richard dimmed early by gathering storm clouds, harbingers of a future steeped in tempest and tears, and the world spun on, oblivious to the monster slowly being nurtured in the heart of ordinary life. The silent cracks of childhood, like underground streams relentlessly eroding a foundation, began to widen as Richard entered the turbulent years of adolescence. This was an age when the human soul is like a kite, yearning to soar, but vulnerable to snapping its tether and plunging into chaos. For Richard, the thread anchoring him to anything resembling normalcy or goodness grew increasingly fragile. The detachment that had once been a vague trait of his childhood now solidified, forming an invisible wall between him and the outside world. He was no longer just a quiet boy, but a teenager carrying a profound loneliness, a sense of alienation amid the laughter and lively preoccupations of his peers, while other boys and girls began to explore the stirrings of first love, stolen dates, and dreams of the future. Richard sank deeper into an inner world that grew ever more complex and shadowy. Perhaps he, too, once yearned for connection, for understanding. But any such efforts, if they existed, dissolved into silence or were distorted by the growing specters in his mind. Unnamed wounds and unresolved resentments from childhood now surged with greater force, like long-caged beasts roaring for release. These were not visible scars on his flesh, but deeper cuts, bleeding within his soul, wounds invisible to others, and perhaps not even fully comprehended by Richard himself. His deviance began to take root, not through overt rebellion, but through private thoughts and warped fantasies he kept locked away. These might have been a perverse obsession with power and control, or a distorted curiosity about the limits of pain, both physical and emotional. Images and ideas that a healthy mind would recoil from became familiar companions during Richard's sleepless nights. Any fledgling faith, any flicker of hope in a better world, seemed smothered by a cynical, bitter inner voice. Perhaps he once sought something to cling to, a belief, an ideal, but was let down by his own experiences or twisted perceptions, feeling betrayed. This betrayal didn't necessarily stem from a single person, but perhaps from life itself, from the unfulfilled promises of fairness and justice he could not find. In 1981, at 18, Richard Evanitz enlisted in the United States Navy. The decision seemed like a potential turning point, an attempt to find discipline, structure, or perhaps an escape from himself. The military, with its rigid rules, unyielding commands, and demand for conformity, might have been expected to mold him, to correct his deviations. But a cage, no matter how sturdy, cannot change the nature of the beast within. If anything, it may make the creature more ferocious, or teach it to conceal its instincts with greater cunning. His years in the Navy, much of it spent on ships adrift in the vast expanse of the sea, likely only deepened Richard's isolation. The confined spaces of a vessel, the repetitive routine of military life, may have become a larger prison, giving his dark thoughts time and space to ferment and grow more toxic. The harsh, sometimes brutal environment of the military might have inadvertently reinforced his skewed views on power, dominance, and the value of human life. Stories of violence and the raw truths of war and conflict, even if he didn't directly experience them, could have planted poisonous seeds in his mind, perhaps during night watches on the ship's deck, amid the lull of crashing waves and a star-strewn sky. Richard confronted his inner demons in their rawest form, with no urban clamor to distract him, no social interactions to mask his thoughts. There was only him and the relentless torment of his mind. Any fragile spiritual beliefs he might have once clung to likely crumbled entirely in the face of reality's harshness and the emptiness of his soul. The silence of the sea may have mirrored the deadly silence in his heart, a heart no longer capable of feeling human warmth, only the cold of despair and smoldering hatred. Spiritual trauma doesn't always require a dramatic event or a singular catastrophe. Sometimes, it's a slow erosion, a loss of faith in goodness, an acceptance that the world is inherently cruel and meaningless. When that faith dies, when there's nothing left to light the way, darkness easily consumes all. The old Richard, the boy with distant eyes in South Carolina, seemed to die during these years. giving way to a new entity, one nourished by wounds, deviations, and spiritual emptiness. When Richard Evanitz left the Navy in 1985 after 4 years of service, he was no longer the young man who had enlisted at 18. He carried with him the experiences and skills of a sailor, but more crucially, a hardened soul, a frozen heart, and a monster within, ready to emerge. The shadows of his past were no longer vague hauntings. They had crystallized into specific urges, perverse desires awaiting their moment. Those years, which should have been a foundation for a mature and meaningful life, instead became a forge, sharpening the invisible weapons he would soon wield to unleash terror. The last glimmers of hope seemed to have extinguished, replaced by a thick darkness that heralded the storms to come. Leaving the Navy, Richard Evanitz emerged with a new facade, a cold confidence, and a sharper, more calculating view of the world. But beneath the veneer of a former serviceman, the beast within stirred relentlessly, clawing for release, the military's discipline and control, which might have temporarily restrained his dark urges, inadvertently equipped him with new tools, the ability to plan, to exercise patience, and to conceal his true intentions. No longer a lost teenager with chaotic thoughts, he had become a potential predator, silently stalking prey and opportunity. The first criminal act, as is often the cruel rule of darkness, is rarely a cataclysmic murder. It typically begins with tentative probes, calculated boundary crossings, actions the perpetrator might justify as not too serious. For Evanitz, it was likely a progression from perverse fantasies to concrete actions, a testing of his own limits and society's after leaving the Navy. He relocated to Northern Virginia, a bustling, crowded region far livelier than his South Carolina hometown. The anonymity of the urban throng may have given him a warped sense of freedom, a chance to act on long-buried desires. No official record pinpoints a definitive first crime with precise dates or victims, as the initial steps of predators like Evanitz often remain shrouded in shadow, unreported or dismissed as minor incidents. But it's reasonable to speculate that before his most horrific crimes came to light, he engaged in exploratory acts of violation. These might have included stalking young women or girls he deemed potential targets. The thrill of watching from afar, the power of knowing their routines and habits while they remained oblivious, likely provided an initial, perverse satisfaction. These early steps may not have involved direct physical violence, but rather subtle invasions, breaches of personal space, implicit threats. He might have broken into someone's home, not to steal valuables, but to feel their presence, to touch personal belongings, leaving behind a vague trace of his intrusion, an invisible warning. Such acts, while not yet causing severe physical harm, clearly crossed moral and legal boundaries. Each undetected success bolstered his confidence, dulled any lingering guilt, and stoked the beast's hunger for more. The first true temptation, in a literal sense, might have been an unexpected opportunity, an unlocked door. A woman walking alone on a deserted street, a moment of a victim's inattention, in Evanitz's warped mind. These weren't random events, but invitations, permissions to enact his desires. He may have started with harassment or sexual assaults, short of murder, acts that sowed terror and humiliation in victims. Such crimes often go unreported, as victims grapple with shame, fear, or societal stigma, unwittingly enabling predators like Evanitz to sink deeper into depravity. The 1990 kidnapping and sexual assault of a woman in Manassas, Virginia, though not the earliest widely known crime later tied to Evanitz, may have been a pivotal milestone in his escalating criminality. This case revealed a growing boldness and a method taking shape. He was no longer just a distant stalker, but an active aggressor, using force to subdue his victim and taking her to a secluded location to commit his depraved acts. The temporary success of this crime, evading immediate capture, likely fueled a sense of absolute power, an intoxicating rush from controlling another's fate. Each unpunished crime blurred the line between good and evil in Evanitz's mind. That first time crossing the threshold may have carried a flicker of fear or hesitation, but when no immediate consequences followed, fear dissolved into smugness and a craving to relive the thrill of dominance. The beast, once it tasted blood, would never settle for less. It demanded more, with greater brutality and Evanitz, enslaved by his own dark desires, was ready to comply. This first step onto an irreversible path was not a singular act, but the prelude to a cascade of increasingly heinous crimes. It marked Richard Evanitz's complete transformation from a man with deviant thoughts into a true criminal, a tangible threat to society. Whatever faint flicker of conscience remained was now wholly consumed by the darkness of his deeds. He had crossed the line, and ahead lay only an abyss, the first tears of his victims. Their desperate cries for help he ignored, became the haunting soundtrack of his sinful journey, a journey where blood and tears would continue to spill. The silence of the night, where he committed his earliest acts, was no longer peaceful but complicit, cloaking the monster as it fully revealed its form. After his initial tentative steps, after tasting the perverse thrill of power derived from violating and controlling others, Richard Evanitz no longer hesitated. The long descent into a hell of crime had no stopping point, only an ever-accelerating, uncontrollable escalation. His criminal acts ceased to be random outbursts and became an integral part of his double life, a dark compulsion that demanded increasingly frequent and brutal satisfaction. Like an addict, the deeper he sank, the stronger the dose he required to achieve the twisted high he craved. Northern Virginia, with its dense population and the complexity of a suburban region near Washington. D.C. became the primary stage for Evanitz's escalating crimes in the early 1990s. He moved between towns like Spotsylvania, Fredericksburg, and Manassas, sowing invisible terror before the true identity of the predator was revealed. His methods grew more sophisticated. He learned how to select victims, how to approach, subdue, and cover his tracks. His military experience, though not directly tied to crime, likely provided him with tactical knowledge skills and observation and situational assessment that he now twisted to serve his sinister purposes. The abductions became more frequent. His victims were often young women, girls he could easily overpower. His approach was typically a sudden attack, using a weapon to intimidate, blindfolding and binding his victims, then taking them to a secluded location, perhaps a deserted forest, an abandoned house, or even the confines of his own vehicle. There, the true nightmares began. His victims endured hours of horror, tortured both physically and psychologically. For Evanitz, it wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was about absolute domination, the sadistic pleasure of witnessing fear and despair in his victims' eyes. The long nights of torment became an essential part of his depraved script. He might hold a victim for hours, even days, prolonging their suffering. His cruelty extended beyond rape to other forms of abuse threats, psychological games, relentless brutality. He sought to break their will, reducing them to lifeless dolls in his hands. For those victims fortunate enough to see daylight again, the light would never be the same. It would forever be haunted by the darkness of what they had endured, by the image of the man who stole their innocence and peace. Alongside the escalating violence, Evanitz's ability to conceal his crimes reached a chilling level of precision. He meticulously erased evidence, chose remote locations, and frequently altered his methods to evade detection. He might wear gloves, mask his face, and take care to leave no DNA behind. This cold calculation revealed a mind no longer swayed by guilt or fear, wholly focused on satisfying his urges and eluding justice. He lived a double life by day, perhaps an unremarkable neighbor or co-worker, by night. The monster within awoke, transforming him into a ruthless predator. His loss of control was evident not only in the increasing frequency and savagery of his crimes, but also in his growing recklessness. Evanitz became bolder, almost daring investigators and fate itself, deep down. There may have been a self-destructive impulse driving him, an unconscious desire to be caught, to end the cycle of sin he refused to acknowledge. Or perhaps he was simply too intoxicated by the power his crimes afforded him to realize he was teetering on the edge of the abyss. The tears of his victims, their stifled cries for help, became the bricks that built a wall separating Evanitz from the world of humanity. He no longer saw them as individuals with emotions and lives of their own, but as mere objects to satiate his warped desires. Empathy, compassion. The fundamental qualities of humanity had vanished, replaced by coldness, cruelty, and a terrifying emptiness. This cycle of depravity had no end, for each crime further entrenched the distortion in his mind, making the beast within ever more ferocious. He had lost all capacity for self-control, enslaved by his darkest impulses. The light and darkness within him were no longer in conflict. The darkness had triumphed, engulfing his entire soul. His prayers, if any, were not for forgiveness, but perhaps for the night to last forever, allowing him to continue his crimes undetected. But no darkness is eternal, and no crime can remain hidden forever. The spiraling vortex of Richard Evanitz's sins was hurtling toward a point where the bloodshed would not only be that of his victims, but his own. The spiral of Richard Evanitz's depravity, already steeped in violence and perverse domination, reached an inevitable, horrifying climax murder. The escalation from abduction and torture to taking a human life marked a terrifying turning point, a final boundary crossed with no way back. When the blood of his victims spilled by his hands, Evanitz was no longer merely a kidnapper or serial rapist. He had become a killer. The beast within him, no longer content with twisted satisfaction, had tasted the ultimate power, the power over life and death. In September 1996, a name was etched forever into Evanitz's criminal legacy and the unending grief of a family. Sophia Silva, the 16-year-old high school student from Spotsylvania, Virginia, with a bright future ahead, became the first known victim of the murderous frenzy consuming Evanitz on an ordinary Saturday evening. Sophia left home to visit a friend and never returned. Her sudden disappearance unleashed terror and anguish for her family and community. Desperate searches were organized, prayers were offered, but hope faded with each passing day. Evanitz abducted Sophia, took her to an isolated location, and inflicted the brutal acts he had grown accustomed to. But this time, something was different. Perhaps her resistance, the fear of discovery, or an uncontrollable rage pushed him to the final act. He killed Sophia. Her body was found over a month later, in late October, in a wooded area near the Rappahannock River. The serene river and surrounding trees stood as silent witnesses to an unforgivable crime. Sophia's light was snuffed out cruelly, leaving behind darkness and immeasurable pain for those she loved. Sophia's death did not stop Evanitz. Instead, it seemed to unlock a new door in his warped mind, crossing the threshold of murder. The grotesque sense of power it brought may have been a new, intoxicating drug. The fear of capture lingered, but it was overshadowed by the smug satisfaction of having extinguished a life and, for the moment, evading pursuit. The tragedy continued. In May 1997, less than a year after Sophia's murder, the Lisk sisters, Kristen, 15, and Katty, 12, vanished from their home in Spotsylvania County in broad daylight. This was an even bolder escalation. Evanitz broke into their home while their parents were away, abducting both sisters. The incident sent shockwaves through the region, enveloping every family with young children in fear. The images of the two beautiful girls, their smiles frozen on missing persons posters, fueled the community's outrage and sorrow. For 5 days, the fate of Kristen and Katty Lisk remained a haunting mystery. 5 days of fragile hope, ceaseless prayers, and paralyzing dread. Then, the worst came to pass. The sisters' bodies were found on the banks of the South Anna River. About 24 kilometers from their home, they had been murdered. Blood was spilled again this time, the blood of 2 innocent, blameless children. Evanitz had not only killed once, but twice, and his victims were mere girls. His crimes had reached an unimaginable level of horror. These murders, particularly the Lisk sisters' case, cemented Richard Evanitz as one of the most intensely hunted serial killers. No longer a faceless figure behind isolated crimes, he became the Spotsylvania Killer, a true monster stalking the community. The silent forests and tranquil rivers where he discarded his victims' bodies could no longer conceal his atrocities. They became scenes of profound tragedy, where the anguished cries of wronged souls seemed to linger. The blood had been shed, and there was no turning back. Each drop of Sophia's, Kristen's, and Katty's blood was a resounding condemnation of Richard Evanitz. He had chosen the path of evil, a road devoid of compassion or redemption. paved only with cruelty and death. The light of hope for his victims, their families, and even his own soul had been extinguished. He had become a cursed figure, burdened by the weight of the lives he had stolen. These murders were the pinnacle of his escalating depravity, the starkest evidence that the beast within Evanitz had fully consumed him. He no longer had control over his actions or any sense of right and wrong. He was a killing machine, driven by perverse desires and boundless cruelty. Prayers were no longer for him, but for his victims, for the peace of their souls, and for justice to be swiftly served. The darkness had enveloped him entirely, and the price for these crimes would be immeasurably steep. Even after blood was spilled, after young lives were snuffed out by his hands, Richard Evanitz showed no signs of stopping or crumbling under the weight of his sins. Instead, he grew more adept at concealing the monster within, cloaking himself in a chillingly perfect facade. His life became a sophisticated performance, with him as the lead actor, flawlessly playing two opposing roles: an ordinary, even mundane man by day, and a bloodthirsty demon when night fell. This duality was not only horrifying, but also a testament to a mind utterly desensitized, capable of a perverse compartmentalization of emotions and actions. By day, Richard Evanitz could be the neighbor you pass on the street, the coworker you exchange small talk with during a break. He held a job, followed routine habits, he shopped for groceries, filled his gas tank, perhaps even smiled and greeted acquaintances. His unremarkable appearance, neither eccentric nor visibly disturbed, made him blend in seamlessly. This disarming normalcy was his most effective disguise, masking the horrific crimes he committed. Who could suspect that this calm, quiet man was the source of terror, gripping an entire region? Who could imagine the dark thoughts and brutal plans churning beneath his placid surface? He maintained a certain orderliness in his daily life, perhaps as a counterbalance to the chaos and savagery of his secret world. His home, possibly a stage for unspeakable crimes, was kept clean and tidy. He was cautious in his speech, avoiding unnecessary attention, always striving to appear as a law-abiding citizen. The contrast between this seemingly orderly existence and the vile, depraved acts he carried out was staggering. Daylight illuminated his house, revealing ordinary furnishings, but it could not dispel the darkness that clung to every wall, every corner, where desperate cries may have once echoed before fading into silence. When the sun set and darkness descended, a different Richard Evanitz emerged. The mask of the ordinary man was cast aside, giving way to ruthless, predatory instincts. Night was not a time for rest, but for action, for stalking, for seeking the next prey. Quiet roads, peaceful neighborhoods, places where people felt safest, became his hunting grounds. The silence of the night was his ally, concealing his sinful footsteps and suspicious sounds. He moved like a specter, blending into the shadows, his cold eyes scanning for opportunity. The blood and tears of his previous victims did not haunt him or deter him. If anything, they may have fueled him, spurring even crueler acts. He felt no remorse, no guilt. His soul seemed utterly hollow, devoid of human emotion. All that remained was cold calculation and a perverse craving to control and destroy. His prayers, if they existed, were likely pleas for the night to linger, for luck to keep him hidden. This double life demanded immense psychological control or a complete absence of conscience. Evanitz seemed to possess both. He could seamlessly separate his two worlds, switching between the roles of ordinary man and predator without a hitch. No emotional leaks, no daytime behaviors betrayed his nocturnal self. This made monsters like Evanitz uniquely dangerous. They hide among us, wolves in sheep's clothing. The contrast between Evanitz's daytime normalcy and nighttime evil painted a horrifying portrait of malevolence. By day, sunlight might touch his face, but it could not pierce the profound darkness within his soul. By night, the shadows enveloped him, and he became one with them, a living embodiment of fear and destruction. Blood was shed in those dark nights, yet by morning, he could wash his hands, don clean clothes, and resume his performance. The tears of his victims may have soaked the earth in remote places, but he could still smile, converse, and carry on as if nothing had happened. The silence of those around him, their lack of suspicion, and the naive belief that evil always reveals itself unwittingly aided Evanitz in sustaining his double life for so long. He was a master of deception, a chameleon blending into any setting. But every play has its final act, and every mask must eventually fall. The light of justice, though sometimes obscured, will ultimately shine into the darkest corners, exposing the horrific truth. And Richard Evanitz's double life, sooner or later, was destined to be unmasked. Amid the endless days of living a double life, amidst the mounting pile of atrocities, a sudden bolt of lightning shattered Richard Evanitz's smug confidence and seemingly flawless plans. It wasn't a police ambush or a carelessly left piece of evidence, but the miraculous escape of a victim, Kara Robinson Chamberlain, a 15-year-old girl. In June 2002, achieved what many others could not. She broke free from the clutches of the monster, and her survival became a vengeful nightmare for Evanitz, plunging him into unprecedented panic. Kara was in the front yard of a friend's home in West Columbia, South Carolina, ironically, Evanitz's hometown, where he had returned after years of terrorizing Virginia, posing as a polite stranger. Evanitz approached Kara, threatened her with a gun, and forced her into his car. His familiar script unfolded: blindfold, bound hands, and transport to a place of captivity, this time, his own apartment, for the next 18 harrowing hours. Kara endured sexual abuse and threats from Evanitz. He likely believed he had total control, that Kara would either be completely subdued or never live to tell her story. But Evanitz underestimated the fierce will to survive and the sharp intelligence of this young girl throughout her ordeal. Kara didn't just endure paralyzing fear, she actively observed, memorizing every detail about her captor and her surroundings. She noted his habits, the items in his apartment, the sounds outside. She refused to break or surrender. Instead, she quietly searched for even the slimmest chance to escape. The faint flicker of hope in her soul never went out. And then, her moment came. While Evanitz slept soundly, Kara, with extraordinary courage, managed to free herself from her restraints. Every movement was deliberate, every breath held. As she slipped out of the rope's grip, in the suffocating silence of the apartment, she crept out, sprinting to a nearby parked car to beg for help. Kara's escape was not only a miracle for her, but a pivotal turning point in the hunt for Richard Evanitz. When Evanitz awoke to find Kara gone, he must have been gripped by sheer panic. His plan had unraveled, his control shattered. For the first time, a victim had slipped through his grasp and could provide the police with invaluable information. He knew his time was running out. The perfect facade he had so carefully constructed was on the verge of crumbling. The fear of capture, of facing justice, was no longer a vague thought. It was now a tangible, imminent threat. With remarkable composure and an astonishing memory, Kara Robinson Chamberlain gave investigators detailed descriptions of Evanitz, his car, and even items in his apartment. She recalled details that Evanitz likely never anticipated, small but critical pieces that helped assemble the full picture of the predator. Her testimony was a torch lighting the path for the police, bringing them closer than ever to the serial killer they had been hunting. Kara's escape was more than a botched crime for Evanitz. It carried a deeper significance, like a harbinger, a warning from some unseen force that his reign of terror could not last forever. The spark of hope from Kara's survival was a dagger thrust into the darkness Evanitz had wrapped himself in. He was no longer an invisible predator. He had been exposed, named, and identified. The nightmares he inflicted on his victims were now turning back to haunt him, embodied in the form of a brave young girl and the relentless pursuit of the law. Blood had been spilled. Tears had fallen. But now, a ray of justice pierced through. The silence of past victims seemed to find a voice through Kara's courage. Prayers for justice began to carry real hope of being answered. For Evanitz, this event marked the beginning of his downfall. He could try to flee, to hide, but the specter of Kara, the shadow of the crimes he committed, would relentlessly pursue him. The false sense of security he once enjoyed was gone, replaced by constant fear and dread that, at any moment, the door could be kicked in, and he would face the truth. The nightmare of retribution had truly begun. After Kara Robinson Chamberlain's escape and her detailed identification of him, Richard Evanitz's world began to implode from within. The initial panic may have subsided slightly, giving way to desperate calculations of flight and concealment, but something deeper, more terrifying than the fear of police capture, started to creep into his mind, a haunting sense that something was watching him. This wasn't the tangible pursuit of investigators, but an intangible, oppressive presence, as if the souls of his victims, their silent cries, were returning to demand retribution, until now. Evanitz had likely succeeded in suppressing any guilt or empathy. He lived in a world where he was the center, the arbiter of life and death, unbound by conventional morality. But Kara's escape, an unforeseen event, cracked the psychological defenses he had so carefully constructed. It was a fissure, allowing the things he had buried deep to resurface. He began to hear whispers in the night, not the wind or ordinary sounds of life, but vague voices, reproaches, faint cries for help he thought he'd forgotten. Images of Sofia Silva, the Lisk sisters, and perhaps other victims whose crimes remained undiscovered, started to haunt him in dreams and even in waking moments. No longer faint memories he could dismiss. They grew vivid, relentless, like spectral figures surrounding him. Their eyes pierced him, not with hatred, but with infinite sorrow and profound disappointment. The light in those eyes, which he had brutally extinguished, now shone back into his dark soul, exposing the undeniable void and guilt within. He might have tried to convince himself it was just stress, the pressure of being hunted, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger, defying logical explanation, alone in a locked room. He still felt another presence, an unseen gaze tracking his every move. Silence, once a comforting ally, became terrifying, filled with wordless echoes. The darkness, his former accomplice, now harbored vague, creeping fears. Perhaps for the first time in his criminal life, Evanitz began to truly feel the weight of his actions, not the punishment of the law, but a judgment from some supernatural force, a cosmic balance disrupted by his atrocities. The blood of his victims didn't just soak into the earth, it seemed to taint the air he breathed, to seep into every cell of his body. Their tears didn't merely fall and dry, they formed dark clouds overshadowing his existence. This paranoia, if it can be called that, didn't stop his crimes as Kara's case showed, but it surely eroded the cold confidence he once exuded. He became more irritable, more restless. Every strange noise, every glance from a stranger, could make him flinch, suspicious. He lived in a state of constant tension, like a wounded animal fleeing invisible hunters. The belief that something was watching might have been an unconscious glimmer of a reckoning with whatever remained of his conscience. No matter how he denied or tried to banish them, those specters lingered, a constant reminder of indelible crimes. They weren't literal supernatural entities, but perhaps reflections of the darkest corners of his soul, the parts he had suppressed and denied. This wasn't active repentance or genuine remorse. It was an instinctual fear, a sense of being hunted not just by humans, but by something greater, more mysterious. Any prayers in his mind now were likely not for forgiveness, but for those specters to vanish, for his false sense of peace to return. But that was impossible. Once the door to this haunting spiritual realm had opened, it would never fully close. Richard Evanitz, who had inflicted terror on so many, was now enduring a form of mental torment, a spiritual chase he couldn't escape, even while still free from the law. The faint light of his victims' wronged souls was beginning to pierce the thick darkness enveloping him. The chase was no longer confined to the haunted recesses of Richard Evanitz's mind. After Kara Robinson Chamberlain's courageous testimony provided critical details, the noose of justice tightened swiftly and relentlessly. Investigators, armed with Kara's invaluable clues, identified their suspect. Evanitz's image and details about his car were broadcast widely. No longer a faceless phantom, he became a fiercely hunted fugitive, a clear target for law enforcement nationwide. Realizing capture was inevitable if he stayed in South Carolina, Evanitz fled. He drove south toward Florida, perhaps clinging to a faint hope of blending into the crowd, starting anew under a false identity, or simply delaying the inescapable. Unbeknownst to him, beyond the police hot on his trail. Another shadow pursued him, a shadow far more terrifying than handcuffs or prison bars. It was the shadow of his own crimes, the relentless presence of the wronged souls he could not escape. Evanitz's flight was not a journey to freedom, but a desperate race against time and the demons within. With every mile he covered, every town he passed, invisible eyes seemed to watch. The distant wail of police sirens, the hum of helicopters overhead, served as constant reminders that he had nowhere left to hide. The strain, the fear of capture, and the haunting specters of his psyche left him increasingly rattled and disoriented. On June 27, 2002, just days after Kara's escape, the chase reached its climax in Sarasota, Florida. Police tracked him down and located his car. A perimeter was set, trapping him with no way out. Blinding police headlights pierced the night. Guns were aimed, and a megaphone blared, demands for surrender. In that moment, every crime, every attempt to flee, collided with reality. Faced with capture and accountability for his barbaric acts, Richard Evanitz made a final, desperate choice. Rather than surrender, rather than face a trial and society's judgment, he turned the gun on himself, inside the surrounded car, with no escape left. Evanitz took his own life. A single gunshot ended the existence of one of the most brutal serial killers, leaving behind countless unanswered questions and unhealed wounds for the victims' families. His death, in a way, was one last act of evasion. He escaped a human trial, years of imprisonment, and the direct confrontation with those he had tormented. But did he truly escape, or did death merely open a door to another form of judgment, an inevitable reckoning with his deeds? The shadow in the night, the one he sensed, the one he feared, was not the police or any tangible pursuer. It was the shadow of conscience, however buried, flickering with a faint awareness of guilt. It was the shadow of his victims. Souls unable to rest, while justice remained incomplete on earth. Evanitz's suicide may have thwarted a criminal trial, but it could not erase his crimes, soothe the pain, or bring peace to his own guilty soul. As his body was removed from the car under the cold glare of the crime scene lights, many likely breathed a sigh of relief that a monster had been stopped. But for those who believe in a spiritual realm, in judgment beyond death, Evanitz's story was far from over. He may have evaded earthly punishment, but the shadow in the night, the shadow of truth and metaphysical justice, likely awaited him somewhere beyond. His collapse was not just the moment of police capture, but the implosion of a soul utterly decayed, a soul that had condemned itself long before any court could. The light of justice may have been dimmed by his suicide, but the darkness of his crimes lingered, heavy and haunting. Richard Evanitz's death by suicide closed the final chapter of a serial killer's life on Earth. He evaded the courtroom, the probing questions of prosecutors, the tears and fury of victims' families. He escaped the judge's gavel, the endless days in a death row cell. For many, this felt like an incomplete ending, a sense that justice had not been fully served, but from a different, more spiritual perspective. Richard Evanitz's true trial may have only just begun. Imagine, after that final gunshot, as Evanitz's guilty soul parted from his body, he did not slip into oblivion or find release. Instead, he found himself standing before a different kind of tribunal, not one held in a solemn courtroom of brick and stone, but in a boundless realm of conscience and memory. This was a trial of the soul, where no defense attorney could plead his case. No legal loopholes could shield him, only the raw truth and undeniable evidence of his life laid bare. The judge was no robed figure, but perhaps a radiant entity, or the intrinsic judgment of the universe, of a creator he may have once denied. The jury was not a panel of random citizens, but the very souls he had harmed, the lives he had stolen, Sophia Silva, Kristen and Kati Lisk, and perhaps other unnamed victims, were no longer cold corpses, but spiritual presences. Their eyes, no longer filled with fear, held a quiet truth, posing a profound question: why? This trial bore no resemblance to earthly legal proceedings. There were no lengthy speeches, no heated debates. Instead, It was a relentless stream of memory, a vivid replay of Evanitz's entire life, from the silent fractures of his childhood, his misguided choices, to the crescendo of his crimes. Every act, every dark thought, every tear shed by his victims was projected with stark clarity, impossible to hide or justify. The light of truth exposed everything, not just his outward deeds, but the hidden motives, the warped distortions of his soul. In this spiritual tribunal, Evanitz could not lie, could not blame circumstance, could not rationalize his actions. He was forced to confront his true self, the monster he had nurtured for so long. The silence of his victims' souls was perhaps more terrifying than any accusation. They needed no words. Their pain was the most eloquent testimony. Their gaze, devoid of hatred, might have carried a profound pity for a soul that had destroyed itself, a soul that chose darkness over light. Prayer, if it could exist in this space, was not a plea for forgiveness from others, but a confrontation with himself, a belated recognition of what was lost, what was destroyed. No verdict was spoken aloud, for the greatest punishment was to see the full truth of his life, the agony he inflicted, and to carry that burden into eternity, or until some form of atonement, if such a thing were possible, could be made. This trial was a spiritual reckoning, a painful purification where Evanitz's soul was stripped of its layers of deceit and self-delusion. The blood spilled on earth now gave way, in this realm, to tears of belated remorse. If his soul could still weep, the darkness he sowed now enveloped him, not as external punishment, but as a reflection of his own inner void. Evanitz's earthly end may have been a full stop, but in the spiritual realm, it could mark the start of another journey, one of facing the consequences of his choices. Justice takes many forms, and it is not always visible to us, yet perhaps no action, good or evil, fails to leave its mark on the universe, and no soul can forever evade the judgment of its own conscience or the unseen laws governing existence. The spiritual trial of Richard Evanitz, though a construct of belief, carries a profound message about responsibility and consequence, a reminder that even in death, truth endures, and justice, in some form, will ultimately prevail. Stepping from the moment Richard Evanitz took his own life, we enter a fictional timeline, an alternate script where he did not choose that final bullet. Instead, he is captured alive, brought to trial, and ultimately sentenced to the ultimate penalty. The prison door slams shut behind him, not a gateway to another escape, but to an earthly hell where time seems to freeze, and silence becomes the cruelest form of judgment. The death row cell, 4 cold concrete walls, a sparse iron bed, a metal toilet, and a sink. This is his shrunken world, a claustrophobic space, confining not just his body but his rotten soul. No more chases, no more predatory plans, no more double life, only Evanitz, facing himself in a terrifying silence. The first days in prison are a shock, even if he braced for the worst. The clamor of the outside world, the sounds of life, are replaced by a near absolute stillness, broken only by the occasional tread of a guard, the creak of iron doors, or the distant echo of other inmates. This silence is not peace, it is torment. It forces him to hear the inner voices he long ignored. In the cell's solitude, there is nothing to distract him. No television, no books, at least initially, no idle chatter, just mute walls and relentless thoughts. The faces of his victims, Sophia, Kristen, Caddy, perhaps others once suppressed, now return with excruciating clarity. They are no longer vague specters, but constant presences in his mind. Their cries, their sobs, echo in the cell's silence. The only light comes from a narrow, barred window or the harsh fluorescent bulb overhead. It cannot dispel the darkness engulfing his soul, a darkness thicker than any night. He tries to sleep, but sleep brings nightmares more horrific than reality, where he relives his crimes or becomes their victim. The blood and tears he spilled now saturate his dreams. The silence judges. No accusations from guards, no physical punishment beyond confinement, but this silence, this isolation, is a mental punishment harsher than any other. It forces him to confront his own emptiness, the futility of his actions. Once, He felt power controlling others' fates. Now, he is powerless, controlled by walls, time, and his own sins. Prayers, if they exist, are not for forgiveness. He likely hasn't reached that awareness. They might be curses, aimless rage, or silent screams of despair. He tries to rebuild mental defenses, but they crumble under the weight of truth and solitude. Days drag on, monotonous and oppressive. Meals slide through a slot. Brief exercise periods, if allowed, offer no relief, and he returns to the walls and silence. He is no longer Richard Evanitz, the terrorizing serial killer, but a number, a prisoner in drab gray, awaiting execution. Yet this waiting is not for release, but for an inevitable end, suspended between a guilty past and a hopeless future. Hell on earth need not be fire and brimstone. Sometimes it is simply silence, solitude, and the unending confrontation with one's inner demons, with no escape, no distraction, in this fictional scenario. Richard Evanitz endures that hell, where every passing second reminds him of what he did and what he has become. The light of the outside world is gone, leaving only the darkness of the cell and the darkness of his soul. Amid the cold concrete walls and near absolute silence of the death row cell, where Richard Evanitz was sinking into despair and the torment of his guilt, an unexpected glimmer of light appeared. It wasn't the radiant sun or a dramatic event from the outside world. It was the presence of a human being, an elderly prison chaplain, who came not to judge, but to listen, to understand, and perhaps to plant a fragile seed of hope in the barren, shadowed wasteland of Evanitz's soul. The chaplain, with his white hair and gentle eyes that held a depth of experience and profound compassion, had met countless prisoners in his years of service. He didn't look at Evanitz with the disgust or fear most would. Instead, his gaze was calm, accepting the man before him, no matter the weight of his sins. He came not at Evanitz's request, but as part of his tireless mission to bring a flicker of warmth, a trace of light, to even the most lost souls in their darkest moments. At first, Evanitz likely resisted, or met the chaplain with indifference, walled off by mistrust. He was accustomed to building defenses, skeptical of anyone, especially those representing faith or morality concepts he had long rejected. He might have stayed silent or offered curt replies, trying to push the chaplain away. Light, however faint, can be blinding to those long accustomed to darkness. But the chaplain was undeterred. He was patient. He didn't preach or force belief. He simply sat in the cell's silence, occasionally asking gentle questions not to unearth guilt, but to learn about Evanitz, the man, and the path that led him here. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart. Behind Evanitz's hardened, cold exterior, the chaplain saw a shattered soul, a human tragically lost. Slowly, perhaps due to unbearable solitude or the chaplain's persistent sincerity, Evanitz began to open up. His first words might have been laced with bitterness, doubt, or self-justification. But the chaplain didn't argue or judge. He listened. He created a safe space where, for the first time in years, Evanitz could voice thoughts and emotions buried deep, however dark or ugly. These meetings were no instant miracle. There was no sudden epiphany, no flood of repentant tears, but they were a beginning, a tiny crack in the fortress of his callousness. The chaplain didn't promise legal forgiveness or an easy escape from consequences. What he offered was another possibility, the chance to face the truth, to take responsibility, and perhaps to find meaning even in the direst circumstances. He might have shared the stories of redemption and mercy, not as rigid doctrine, but as words from a friend. He spoke of light and darkness, not as opposing absolutes, but as parts of every human, explaining that even in the deepest shadows, a spark of light could be found. He didn't seek to erase Evanitz's guilt, but to help him acknowledge it, confront it, and perhaps begin a journey toward atonement, if only in his mind. These infrequent visits became a fragile anchor for Evanitz. They didn't lessen his suffering, but they gave it a different meaning. The cell's silence was no longer purely judgmental. At times, it became a space for reflection, for silent, unformed prayers, not yet directed to any deity, but perhaps a faint cry from a soul yearning for release from itself. The chaplain's solitary light was not a blazing torch to banish all darkness, but a small, flickering candle, steady in the wind, enough to show there was another path beyond despair and self-destruction. Blood had been spilled, tears had fallen, but perhaps there was still a chance for a new beginning, not of life, but of awareness, and maybe a sliver of peace for his soul before facing the final end. The chaplain's words, like cool drops of water, slowly seeped into the parched soil of Evanitz's heart, sowing the seed of something he could not yet name. The infrequent conversations with the elderly chaplain, like small keys, slowly unlocked the sealed and buried doors of Richard Evanitz's memories. The silence of the death row cell, no longer just an empty torment, sometimes became a mirror, forcing him to revisit his entire sinful journey, not through the lens of self-justification or callous detachment, but with a clearer, albeit pained and chaotic, perspective. Memories flooded back, not in orderly sequence, but as jagged shards of a shattered mirror, each one sharp, cutting into his core. He recalled the silent cracks of his childhood, the distant gaze of young Richard, the loneliness amidst crowds, then the wayward teenage years, nameless wounds, and his decision to join the Navy and attempt to escape himself that only sank him deeper into emptiness. The ghosts of his past were no longer vague. They emerged sharply, carrying emotions he thought had long hardened. He remembered the first temptation, the trembling yet thrilling step across the line, the perverse sense of power when he first controlled another, the twisted satisfaction of seeing fear in their eyes. Then the spiral of depravity began, spinning faster, growing uncontrollable. The abductions, the long nights of torture, the cunning concealment of his crimes. He saw his victims' faces again, not as fleeting images, but as real people, with lives, hopes, and loved ones waiting. The fateful murders. Sophia Silva. Her name echoed in his mind, no longer a sick trophy but a haunting horror. He relived the moment the light faded from her eyes, the coldness of her body. Then Kristen and Caddy Lisk, the innocent sisters, their pure smiles now like daggers piercing whatever heart he had left. Blood, no longer abstract, was vivid red, warm, its metallic tang lingering in the prison air. The double life, ordinary man by day, demon by night. The deception, the pretense, now appeared as a contemptible farce. He had fooled the world and himself. Kara Chamberlain's escape, a lightning bolt shattering his arrogance, the panic of realizing he was no longer untouchable. Then the sensation of being watched, the invisible specters, the faint stirrings of conscience beginning to whisper. Reviewing these memories, there was no twisted pride, no justification, only a raw, repulsive truth. He was a monster. He had caused immense suffering, stolen countless lives, and destroyed not just his victims, but their families and his own existence. A belated confession began to form, not for a courtroom or the chaplain, but to his own conscience, a painful acknowledgement that everything he did was wrong, cruel, unforgivable. Remorse, an emotion he thought alien, stirred not as a crashing wave, but as subtle undercurrents, eroding the last bastions of his callousness. This wasn't remorse for being caught or facing execution. It was genuine, a deep anguish for the devastation he wrought on others, on the world. Tears, perhaps the first in years, rolled down his gaunt face in the cell's darkness, not from fear, but from a shattering realization of a life utterly misguided. Confronting these blood-soaked memories was agonizing, like peeling back flesh to expose a festering wound. Yet it was necessary. No healing could begin without acknowledging the injury. The chaplain's faint light, like a candle, gave him the courage or desperation to face his darkness. For the first time, he glimpsed, however dimly, the shape of his sins and, perhaps, a fragile yearning for atonement. Though he knew it was nearly impossible, his silent prayers found a direction, no longer curses, but a desperate cry from a drowning soul. After endless days confronting blood-soaked memories, after brief but profound conversations with the elderly chaplain, a deep, albeit slow, transformation began within Richard Evanitz. Remorse ceased to be a fleeting, vague emotion. It became a constant burden, a gnawing pain relentlessly tormenting his soul. From this pain, from the utter despair of recognizing the full brutality of his actions, a new need arose, the need to pray, a true prayer, the first in his life. Before, if Evanitz ever thought of God or a higher power, it was likely through curses, defiance, or selfish pleas for luck in his crimes. Now, everything was different. This prayer didn't stem from fear of punishment or a desire to escape his fate. It came from a deeper place, from the complete shattering of his selfish ego, from an absolute acknowledgement of his sins, and from a fragile yearning to connect with something greater, purer, in the near absolute silence of the cell. On a night when darkness enveloped him and memories of his victims surfaced vividly, Evanitz found himself kneeling beside the cold iron bed. No rituals, no scriptures, just him and his soul's anguish. The prayer wasn't spoken aloud, perhaps because he felt unworthy of letting such tainted sounds escape. It was a silent stream of thoughts, emotions, a wordless unburdening. He didn't pray for his own forgiveness, knowing his sins were too vast to be undone. He didn't pray to escape execution, accepting it as the price for his deeds. Instead, his prayers were for those he had harmed. He prayed for Sofia Silva, for her young soul to find peace, to rest in a place free from suffering. He pictured her face, not in her final, terrified moment, but radiant with the smile of a girl full of life. Tears fell again, not of self-pity, but of anguished regret for stealing her future. He prayed for Kristen and Caddy Lisk, the little angels. He begged for their rest, for their innocent laughter to never be forgotten. He felt a fraction of their parents' indescribable pain, sharing it, though he was its cause. He prayed for other victims, those who survived but carried lifelong scars. He asked for them to find peace, to rediscover trust in life, knowing his actions left indelible marks. His prayer wasn't a list of demands, but a confession, a heartfelt apology, a complete bearing of his weakness and guilt before an unseen force he hoped was real and listening. He expected no response, no sign. The act of praying itself brought a fragile relief, as if a tiny fraction of his crushing burden lifted, if only for a moment, in those silent prayers. Light and darkness intertwined. The darkness of his sins, his cruelty, remained undeniable, but the light of remorse, of belated compassion, though faint, began to flicker. Blood had been spilled, unchangeable, yet tears of atonement, though unable to wash away the blood, testified that even in the darkest soul, a faint hope of redemption lingered, even at death's threshold. This was Evonitz's first true prayer, because it was the first time he prayed not for himself, but for others, for the souls he had wounded, in that rare, selfless act. He found a semblance of peace, an acceptance of his fate, in preparation for a final reckoning, not with the executioner, but with the ultimate judgment of conscience and the universe. The cell's silence was no longer wholly terrifying. It became a sacred space where a broken soul struggled to find its way back, knowing the path might not lead to paradise. The day of execution arrived, not as a raging storm, but as a quiet, somber dawn after a long night of tempests. Richard Evanitz, no longer the monster who sowed terror, nor the man tormented by relentless nightmares, was now a withered figure, a soul exhausted, carrying an almost serene acceptance, a fragile peace that felt strangely profound. He took his final steps without defiance or panicked fear. Perhaps the prayers whispered in the dark, the belated tears of atonement, had partially cleansed the grime of his crimes, not to erase them, but to allow him to face death in its rawest form, as a human, however deeply fallen. The dim light of the prison corridor no longer evoked dread, but seemed part of a tranquil tableau. During the final procedures, he remained silent. His eyes, once filled with cruelty and coldness, now held only a distant, empty gaze, no longer frenzied. In those last moments, he likely didn't dwell on his crimes, but on release, not from punishment, but from himself, from the crushing weight of a life veered hopelessly off course. His final breath was gentle, like a leaf drifting from a branch on an autumn afternoon. No struggle, no last words, only silence, and an almost unbelievable sense of peace that had found its way to a shattered soul. Death came, solitary, but no longer a gruesome punishment, rather, an inevitable end, a return to dust, carrying the remnants of a sinful life that had, at the tunnel's end, glimpsed a faint spark of light. Blood and tears had ceased to fall. Only stillness remained.